All right. Welcome, everyone. I will give everyone a minute to enter the webinar. While folks are accumulating, go ahead. I always love to see where people are joining in from. So go ahead and use the chat feature in Zoom to let us know where you're joining from. Okay, good. Got some coming in already. We've got La Crosse, Wisconsin. We've got San Francisco, St. Louis, Missouri, Las Vegas, Tampa, Florida, Memphis, Tennessee, Minneapolis, Portland, Oregon, Saudi Arabia, welcome. San Jose, St. Louis, Raleigh, Atlanta, Berlin, welcome. Chandler, Arizona, Charlotte, nice. Welcome, everybody. DC, Tel Aviv, Vancouver, Idaho, Denver. Great. Well, with that, we'll get started. Welcome everybody to our webinar. This is a joint production of Pendo and GLIDR. Title of the webinar is Continuous Discovery in Product-Led Companies. We have two esteemed panelists today. We have Eric Boduch, the founder and chief evangelist of Pendo, a product cloud that helps digital product teams and application owners deliver software experiences that users love. Eric's been involved with both startup and publicly traded software companies in senior management positions since 1995. He has extensive technology marketing, product management, strategy development, and business development experience, and he's been a co-founder of 3 different startups that have raised over 125 million in aggregate and has been an executive at 2 different public companies. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, thank you. I think I need to take that 1995 off there in the future. just say it.
All right, and we have Jonathan Wylie. So Jonathan is the VP of Product at GLIDR, a product management software company empowering product teams to build a data-driven roadmap. Jonathan leads both product management and product design and loves being a product person, building product for product people. He has a background in anthropology and ethnography and got his MBA at Berkeley. Go Bears. Prior to GLIDR, Jonathan was the VP of product for Goodco, where he built a cultural analytics platform to help enterprises utilize personality data to manage hiring and retention. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks. And to be fair to the whole audience, I made John say the Go Bears part, but you know, he loves it.
I do, yes.
Yeah, do I get a shout out for the Tartans? I mean, come on.
You do now. Okay, so for the audience, a couple of housekeeping things. This is being recorded. Q&A. If you have any questions, please get them in and we will do our best, time permitting, to answer them at the end of the webinar. Okay, with that, my name is John Falker, as I said, Director of Marketing at GLIDR. I'll be your moderator, and we will get into the agenda now. So here's what we're going to cover. Pretty simple. First, we will define product-led. It's a term that is getting pretty buzzy, and I'm sure everyone on the webinar has heard of it. We will define it. We will then define continuous discovery and its role in product-led companies. Thirdly, we will cover a continuous discovery use case, and we'll wrap by discussing how this all fits together. So with that, let's start with number 1. Eric, Pendo, your company, talks a lot about being product-led and furthermore, enabling your clients to be product-led. So probably no one better than you to help us define the term.
Yeah, thanks. I'm definitely happy to help define the term. I often find it's better to lead with what product-led is not. And I think there's a myth around product-led and more specifically product-led growth. And being product-led is not just about using your product to acquire and grow customers. And it's not just about freemium. I think there's a big myth that, like, unless I have a free or a freemium offering, I can't be product-led. I don't think that's true. I also don't think it's true that it only works when the user and the buyer are the same. I think you can have a product-led company that sells to the enterprise. And then finally, you know, being product-led in your product as a whole is not a replacement for sales and marketing teams. And I think that's really important to emphasize that point. You are going to need sales and marketing at some point in your product's, you know, or your company's life. You might not need it in the beginning. You might be able to drive a lot directly through your website, through your product, but you're going to need a sales and marketing team, or else you risk kind of, you know, stalling at a certain point. And Brianne Kimmel had a great talk at Industry about this. So having said what it's not, let me talk a little bit more about what it is. And first from a perspective of growth. So if we think about it from, you know, what is product-led? And if you want to click one slide forward. So I think of it as using your product and your product data to convert prospects, retain users, and expand customers. So we're figuring out, and we're talking about using product to first create business. Second, make sure those customers are happy. And then third, figure out how to grow them and make sure they're continuing to get value. And that's really looking at this from a growth lens. But you can also look at being product-led from a whole cultural perspective, right? What does being product-led mean to marketing? Well, it means your product's a channel, right? You can do things like promote in product, generate funnel via your product, upsell in your product. It also means, if you're product-led in your marketing department, that your product is a lens into the customer. So you can see things by looking at product data like power users, advocates. You can look at and see how product usage can be used to impact your messaging, right? So based upon how people are actually using your product, you can see what messages might resonate in your online and offline marketing materials. You can discover new use cases if you're really product-led in the marketing group. Third major area for marketing is like communication medium, right? You can use your product itself to build your community, to announce features and news. You don't have to use email as your primary or only mechanism for new announcements. You can deliver even targeted thought leadership content directly through your product. And that's some different ways marketing can become product-led. And you can also apply some of the product-led culture thought process to sales, right? Your product can help you manage leads. You can score leads based upon product usage. You can capture and share prospect feedback, right? All of this helps you manage leads. You can use your product to assist your sales motion. This can be things like triggering of alerts or events when usage or user seats have been hit or about to be hit, so your salespeople can reach out. You can use product to help optimize your sales outreach. Like, I think it's great when people look at, you know, how are their customers or their trials using the product, and then customize their outreach. Like, as a great example of that, if you were selling marketing automation software, your salesperson might notice that they're using lead scoring a lot. So when they call to follow up and ask about how the free trial is going, it might be like, oh, I see you've used lead scoring a lot. This is why we think that that particular set of functionality is awesome. So there's lots of different ways. You know, I touched on marketing and sales, but we could go into what it does for customer success, for product and engineering. There's lots of different ways that culturally being product-led can impact how you're running your business. But that could be a whole nother webinar in and of itself.
All right. I like the term, it allows the product to be a lens to your customers. Well, thank you for that, Eric. With that definition of product-led, Jonathan, let's go over to you. The GLIDR team works a lot on continuous discovery. What does it mean for you and the GLIDR product team?
Yeah, and I'll start by connecting it to what Eric said. And I think that the mindset that I talk about a lot internally, as you know, in terms of product led, is that really for us that means everyone is working on the product in some way, shape, or form. Because the world has really shifted. The barriers to entry in new markets is a lot lower than it ever was. Switching costs is a lot lower than it ever was for customers. Customers have a lot more choices. So that means we have to build things that they absolutely love. And that actually means, as Eric was just mentioning, that every single touch point with the customer has to contribute to the product experience. That whole thing really has to come together, because that is ultimately your competitive advantage in this world that we live in today. And so continuous discovery is a really important aspect of that, right? Because all of that implies that we really need to get close to our customer, as close as we possibly can. In fact, some of our customers talk about it as maintaining zero distance from the customer, and they want their whole company to have zero distance from the customer. That's a big goal. And so I think of continuous discovery as a loop that runs synchronous to your Agile build loop. And so this is where we're really seeking to get inside and ensure that and understand the customer, understand their needs and the context within which they operate, and make sure that we're building the right thing. Because when you talk to product managers, like at the end of the day, what we all worry about is, are we building the right thing? And so this is our way to answer that on an ongoing and everyday basis. And when I sort of look at this loop between discovery and delivery, and I love the infinite circle, because we're going to go through a lot of those loops today as we talk. Great product teams are spending about 80% of their time on the discovery side of that loop and 20% on delivery. Now, engineers spend more of their time on delivery and less time on discovery. And so, together they're sort of flowing through that loop. But I think it's important that we sort of balance out both sides of this. And so practically speaking, that's sort of the theoretical of continuous discovery. I think practically speaking, this means we're maintaining a constant, every week, every sprint contact with our customers. And we're using those touch points, every one of those touch points, to run little research projects or little discovery projects to actually try to uncover, either validate a solution that we're working on, or uncover new context around something, or new opportunities to help move a business outcome forward. And so that's kind of the last thing I'd say, is that discover this whole process. And, we won't talk about it a lot today, because I think, there have been a lot of folks writing books on OKRs and other things, but, product continuous discovery works best when you have a goal. When you have an outcome you're trying to push. And so it's always useful to keep that in mind, that at the end of the day, as you deliver product experiences, I think Dan Olson had a nice little pyramid between sort of the value proposition, and then the next layer up was the user experience. The next layer up was the UI. And you can sort of lose at any one of the higher stages. You're not going to win on those alone. But I think I'd add to the base of that really the outcome. If you lose sight of the outcome, then why are we doing the thing we're doing? And it becomes really hard to measure the output of continuous discovery. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through things today.
And
awesome. So you mentioned something that I wanted to dig in a little bit, this whole dual track Agile, right? Versus continuous discovery. Talk to me a little bit about, dual track Agile versus continuous discovery, and how, like when I hear dual track Agile and Agile in general, I feel like the issue, especially with dual track Agile, is like, does it promote this feature factory kind of side effect that we've gotten a little out of Agile, where we're so good now at just being able to pump out outputs that we tend to worry less about outcomes. Now, is the naming convention, does that help continuous discovery?
I think it does some. So, one of the reasons dual track Agile is one of those names that it is synonymous essentially with the same process when that process is done really well. But the name dual track Agile was something that Jeff Patton and Marty Kagan came up with at one point. And I don't think either one of them really particularly like it either. And I think it does promote a sense, well, first of all, it makes it sound too hard, right? This is hard enough. The process of continually learning in your life, especially around your product, is a hard process. And I feel like when we start calling things dual track Agile, it starts to sound more technical and more difficult. But the truth is, yeah, I think Agile has been turned into just another sort of feature factory delivery model, not in the best teams, but in mass. And I think it's easy to take dual track Agile and make it into the same thing and think you're just going to pump things out a one way sort of street. And most of the older tools that we all have are just empowering that mindset. And I think this is the difference. This is where GLIDR and Pendo are both trying to build a future that is truly learning driven, right? That is truly data driven. And what do the tools of the future really look like? If we want to continue learning and put data at the center of all of our activities here, put the customer at the center, as opposed to building a factory of features.
all right. So Eric gave us a great definition of not only what product-led is, but what it is not, perhaps more importantly. and Jonathan followed with continuous discovery. So with that general framing of both of those terms, and by the way, audience, if you have other interpretations of those terms or have questions related to those terms, again, feel free to use the question and answer feature in Zoom, and I will put those to Eric and Jonathan. So with that said, and those definitions out of the way, let's start to look at how this is applied in the real world in the weekly or daily context of a digital product team. Jonathan, let's give that one to you first. So there's a lot of potential applications of continuous discovery. What's one sort of use case that you might pick?
Yeah, so it's really kind of funny when people talk to me about discovery in general. I think they really would love a linear process, and that's because our minds really just want that, right? We want to say we start here, we run through these steps, and we arrive at this other point. And the truth of the matter is, it's a big infinite loop, and you can start anywhere along that loop. And so, you know, that could be oftentimes like an observation of a pattern within the data might kick off discovery. An open-ended question. So you might have seen some movement in your churn rate, either positive or negative, and you might say, let's learn about what's actually happening there. You might have an objective that you're trying to achieve, and so you're going to dig in to find more opportunities. Or in this case, let's just say, I think for simplicity, let's just say we had some customer feedback or a feature request that sort of start to come in and they start to pile up, and it's something a little bit unexpected, right? So that's something we haven't seen before, or something that is a little counterintuitive to us. So I think that's probably a good place to start.
Okay. And just a quick aside, we did have an attendee ask whether the slides will be available to refer back to. Yes, they will. So we will publish these. There'll be a link to the entire recorded webinar, and then we will also publish the deck as a standalone asset. Okay, so Jonathan, you sort of referenced this, this first step, and the use case is in the context of fielding user feedback on perhaps new feature ideas, right?
Yeah, that's a good place. That's a common place to start, not the only place.
Right. Okay. So let's run with that as the use case. So in step 2, Eric, this is certainly one of Pendo's strengths. So talk to us a little bit about how a product team might create mechanisms to manage the intake of that customer feedback and feature requests, and then begin to prioritize them and analyze them.
Sure, happy to. You know, I mean, first, customer feedback is a gift, right? All feedback is a gift. It's like a cliche from somewhere. I think my mom told it to me when I was a little kid. I think, you know, it is important. I mean, people, they're taking time out to give you feedback. So you should make sure you manage it, you keep it, you collect it directly, and you respond to it. So starting at kind of the beginning of that, I think it's really important that you capture feedback directly, whether that's through self-service, you know, meaning your customers can enter feedback directly into your product, whether that's through your team members, your customer success people, you know, typing in feedback directly after their customer calls. I think you want to make this as transparent as possible. You want to get it direct from as close to, if not directly from the source, as much as possible. So you want to capture all that information. It can be overwhelming. We try to organize it. We have this concept of like libraries where we can store information. And part of that is then categorizing this information as we capture it. So thinking of this as concepts like themes, right? Like here's some feedback on, to take my previous example about lead scoring and categorize it as that theme, or feedback on user experience and categorize it that way inside of the library. So you start setting up, you know, patterns, and it's important to have all this feedback too fed to one place. I make this reference of this concept of a library, which I think sounds a lot better than, you know, like a backlog or something like that. But what you're doing is making sure you're capturing feedback, you're gathering demand all in one single place that people can have access to, that they can work off of, that they can make notes on top of. And then I think it's important that as you're looking at these themes, you can dig back into product data too, and do some more analysis. Like if the feedback is, the user experience for setting up lead scoring is horrible, you could actually go back in your product data and see like, how well do people go through this funnel? What should be 5 steps? Does it take them too long? Do they get distracted? Do they have to start over again? What happened? So I think there's a lot of data you can add to that additional feedback from the usage of your product. And then one of the big things as you start looking at solving some of these areas, right, is you can go back to this library and you can say, show me everything about lead scoring and the user experience because I want to make it better. Then not only you have that data organized for you, but you're also thinking about, okay, how do I contact these users? And one of the things that I think is cool we do at Pendo is we'll actually target people that we know have used particular areas of functionality, and the product manager will pop up a little guide saying, hey, I see you've used lead scoring a lot. I'd love to talk to you as we revisit the user experience for lead scoring. Would you like to give us feedback? And click here and it connects right to a Calendarly and can schedule a call for a PM. I think those types of things are great ways to be able to not only capture feedback, to organize the feedback, but be able to interact with it. And then finally, you got to think about, how you respond to the feedback and make sure everyone is updated so they make sure that their voice is heard. It doesn't have to be you're saying yes to people, but you want to make sure that there's a closed loop on this conversation during this customer feedback process too. So
okay.
Other things to add to that.
I think I would just want to double down on that last point, that, part of it is like having the way these tools actually are enabling us to like target the people to talk to. Because one of the things that's so hard in this whole continuous discovery process is the process of sourcing, right? Sourcing the right people that are going to have the insight for these conversations and trying to get those touch points scheduled. I'd say that's like one of the biggest barriers. And so leveraging platforms like Pendo and like GLIDR to do that has been revolutionary for me. And really, but that point about once you set it up, once you talk to them, closing the loop. That means if you launch a feature that's relevant to it or an improvement, it means communicating with them, right? They'll feel special. And that goes a long way to help people say, hey, you gave us feedback. We acted on that feedback. Maybe we didn't do the exact thing you said, but which is rare. But here's an experience we think you're going to love, and that communication back to them is really critical.
Yep. Okay. So we've fielded some qualitative customer feedback. We've begun to use product analytics to analyze and filter quantitatively. So Jonathan, sort of the third step in this process would go back to a little bit of a qualitative step, which is generative interviews, right?
It can be. And so I think the thing that the way that I think about the next step is it really depends on what we learned in that first one, right? So we get some feedback and we look at the data and there's going to be some questions that come up. And so, I think one of the things we dealt with we have a concept in our application of like adding statuses and things and sections to things. And we have 3 areas you can do that. And 2 of them were performing well and 1 was not performing well at all. And we just really had no idea why. We went into the data and people were succeeding in one, not another, right? And so that then leads us to really wonder, like, the UI is the same. What are we not doing in one place versus another place? And so it was kind of a funny little conundrum. It wasn't a big problem for us. We eventually solved it, but it was something that if I had seen something like that, then I'm thinking, all right, interviews are an interesting place, right? Because I might want to talk to some of those people who started a flow and failed, or who gave feedback about something being difficult that was unexpected for me. But I'll generally look at what kind of question we want and then pick the method that's most appropriate. So that could be a survey. Okay. Could be a contextual inquiry, but in lots of cases, it is a generative interview. So let's just go there first.
Okay.
And these things, I will say, generative interviews. I think I don't always call them that. I did hear because I think that what you're really trying to do in this is not test solutions to something. So you're not just seeing a problem in your data and then jumping to the solution. You're really saying, like, let's learn more about the context. And the bigger the problem you're seeing or the bigger opportunity that you think might be there, the more you really want to just dig into customer context and get them to share some stories, and explore the things that all exist around this so that you can make sure you have a complete understanding. So this is all about growing broad and deep. And there's many, like we could have a whole discussion on how to conduct interviews, and that's not really the focus of today. But this can be very fun, and you can be, but there's also some places it goes off the rails if you get too rigid with it, if you sort of lose your focus. So it's really about maintaining what I would kind of call, like in kayaking, you have the concept of like riding the rail when you're like right on the current. So you're kind of doing that here, right? You're trying to like follow the customer where they want, but also keep it on track. And so it's a bit of an art, but the whole goal is to gather context and understand the space of the opportunities that exist. Eric,
Okay.
did you want to add to that as well?
No, I think that was good. I had to check and make sure I wasn't accidentally muting myself. I think that was good how you covered that. I think, as we go through the process, right, you're just trying to gather as much information as possible here so that when you start thinking about what to build, you have as much as possible to make the best decisions possible.
Yeah.
And Eric, but before we continue on through this loop, we had a question pop up from Nate that I think is particularly relevant to you, well, to both you and Jonathan. So Nate asks, what tools are you using to gather and aggregate customer feedback? And then how do you parse through all those insights to find those that are most helpful or relevant?
You want to go first, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant to do any sort of self-promotion. So we actually use Glite. We build GLIDR for this purpose, and we use GLIDR. And we use GLIDR actually in conjunction with Pendo. And those are kind of the two. And then we use Intercom as well. And those things all kind of stream into GLIDR. It's one of the places we bring it together. But and then we use tools like Figma for prototyping that we'll talk about later. But I think that is, we have found that sort of the qualitative data coming into GLIDR and the quantitative data and qualitative data that's coming into Pendo have just been our massive like game changer for us in terms of how we think about things.
And
yeah,
go ahead, Eric.
And now I was going to say on our end, we capture NPS data through Pendo. We do survey data through Pendo. We bought a company called Receptive that helps us organize information and capture user feedback. So there's lots of different ways I think you can capture that. And then I think one of the most important things is just how you organize it, how you act on it, and how you make sure you respond back to it.
Yeah. But it is, to that point, it is critical that you do this, because too many teams, and I think one place teams do kind of go wrong is they just toss stuff into Confluence and no one ever looks at it again. And I think, you want to get a better system than that, or if you do, you need to really curate that system. Otherwise, you're just writing notes for nothing. If you can never access.
Yeah, or what's even worse in Google Docs, right? Like the people that every single product manager has their own Google Docs somewhere, and you join a company and like, where's the feedback? Well, like, let me share 18 different documents in a lot of different formats with you. And you're like, oh.
Yeah, earlier in my career, we started building a company that was like trying to pull together like market research from around the world. And we found that and this is like 8 or 9 years ago, and so much of that data at the time, it's much better now, but so much of that data at the time lived on PowerPoint decks on user research teams that were in other continents, and never got shared and across different products and different time horizons. So it's challenging. If you're not, you kind of want to get that together early on and keep it organized. It's a worthwhile investment.
Okay. And to be super specific, and Eric and Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but to Nate's question, Pendo, and Jonathan, I'll speak about our own use case at GLIDR. So Pendo, we are actually collecting the forms we're creating to collect the feedback, are Pendo forms, whether they're NPS or otherwise, and then that information is ingested into GLIDR, correct?
We move it into GLIDR, and then we also ingest information via Intercom, which automatically, we have an integration built that pulls it into GLIDR.
Yeah, okay. All right, so continuing through this illustration here. So we get into opportunities and solutions. Jonathan, you had discussed, you had sort of started to get into that, but continue us through this loop a bit, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So, I think one of the things you're doing, as I mentioned, is you're going broad in those interviews and you're really trying to map the space. And so as you map that overall space, the next phase is really to come back and say, what opportunities did we spot in the space? Because they could be different than what the customer was communicating, right? You may have said they had this problem with your application, but it was actually a larger problem that you discovered, or a larger opportunity. And I think it's important to say, like, what are all the opportunities that you found, and that really sets up the way that you can then develop or sort of think about solutions for each of those opportunity spaces. I really like Teresa Torres's sort of opportunity solution tree for this, but there are lots of things, and the real key is no matter what framework you use, be visual about it. Don't assume that anybody on your team got a shared understanding of those interviews that you did, even if you were both on the call, right? It's good to debrief right away, and it's good to understand like where you differed and how you saw the problem differently. And I think being visual forces you to sort of put things down and say, these are the opportunities we heard, these are the problems the customer is having, that kind of stuff. So customer experience mapping can be great in this respect. But like that conversation is really the critical factor. And then I think the other thing that I see teams do all the time when looking at opportunities and solutions is just that they don't pull things apart enough. They conflate. Conflation seems to be like a really strong tendency. And here is what I really mean by that is just like we sort of say, oh, they said something about this and this, and they must be related. Sort of mentally, we sort of merge those things together, and we don't therefore have clarity around the individual aspects of the problem that are contributing. So you got to keep pulling things apart until you feel like you get to its root.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let me chime in on one of my little rants on opportunities and solutions here. Putting my product management hat on for a second, one of the things that triggered was this whole thing of like, you know, product managers need to be passionate about the problem. And when people are developing, you know, solutions to problems, I often see product managers will go in there and they'll be like, I have the solution. And they're kind of just selling that to design and saying like, here's the problem, here's the solution. You know, now you design dev, you go build this, right? Do you see that a lot too, or is it just me?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Happens all the time. It's really easy though, especially if one of the negative side effects I think that you're getting at of getting deep customer knowledge, especially firsthand knowledge, is you automatically assume then that you know, and then sometimes it's easy to just jump right to the solution and pass it along.
Okay.
You know, but John, I think there's also, you know, one of the things we didn't talk about there is like that opportunity space and the solution that to get past what Eric's talking about. I think it's got to be critical that you come up with a lot of solutions, because what you don't want to do at the end of the day is arrive at the place Eric just mentioned, which is product manager says this is a solution, and then the only real tests are, is this solution correct? Because it's really hard in the real world to say, is a solution the right one in abstract? It's easier to say, is it better than this other one at driving a particular outcome? So that's why the outcome is always critical, is because that's the measurement, right? I need to achieve X amount of, you know, X change or X, you know, growth in the metric. And so if you have that, then you can say, here's a bunch of opportunities. Now we can test them next to each other and say which one actually solves the problem better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that we are, so in this loop, we're at prototype and test. At this point, we would start to begin to think about what to build and how to test it. Eric, this is also another area where Pendo shines. Can you walk us through the next few steps a little bit?
You want me to walk through kind of the prototype and test, or want to move on to like the launch?
Let's talk about now that we've identified some potential opportunities, figuring out which ones we're actually going to prototype and then moving from there.
Sure. So, I mean, I think we do a lot of different testing, a lot of different approaches to testing to try to figure out which solution is the best for our customers. Where we'll go through and just run different experiments. We'll look at how people get through a series of tasks, like how well do they accomplish the tasks. And as we're testing these solutions, we might be testing one or different ones with different segments of our customer base, just to get some feedback, you know, via our kind of beta program. Like, do you like how we're solving this problem now? And we'll run those out with very small, you know, relatively small groups of customers. We're getting feedback on different, you know, prototypes / experiments, I guess is a good way to phrase it. And then based upon both that quantitative feedback, like how well they're actually getting to the end result or the outcome we want to see, and also the qualitative feedback in terms of actual, conversations, feedback, surveys, we then use that to choose the option we want to move forward and continue developing under. Is that similar to how you guys do things at GLIDR?
Yeah, so that's very similar. I mean, I think again, we're kind of looking at the nature of the solution and what we're trying to learn. So I think, ultimately, we're trying to get it obviously to like, does the thing we're doing actually solve a real customer pain point? So you might have thought that because you had a conversation, but now you can validate it a little deeper. Does that solution actually move the needle on and solve it in the problem in a compelling way? Does it move the needle on your outcome? Is it usable? Is it discoverable? So we're answering all those questions. And I think the way that I've typically thought about prototyping, oftentimes we're starting with, simple wireframes and things like that. So we use Figma there. And I think here to back to the question about tooling, and I'll shamelessly just sort of promote Figma. I love their product in this regard, but that sort of simple testing and building, we really maintain one file that has everything. Every prototype is stacking up as its own page within there. So as we do that, we're testing 10 or 12 prototypes in a week if it's a big problem, when we're spun up more. But we're not testing those all with customers. So we're testing those internally first to sort of weed out the obvious problem areas, and then combining ideas until we get down to a few things that we're going to test with customers. And then we're testing. And then, as Eric said, we're like moving through different phases depending on what we're actually trying to learn at any given spot, right? And so it really kind of depends. But there's lots of fun things you can do with testing. And if you break it down between sort of like research and experiments and market and product, you kind of have this whole matrix of fun stuff you can do, right? You can validate demand with things like fake doors and stuff like that. You got to be a little careful. Some guys wrote a really interesting book on Tristan Kromer's blog called The Real Startup Book. And it has like 70 or 80 different testing methodologies. If you guys are I would definitely check that out. It's a fun reading, if nothing else, right? And there's like 1 million smoke tests in there that you will never heard of.
Yeah. I was going to say that's a lot of tests. I can't say I've ever gone through that many different kinds, but I'll have to check that book out.
Yeah, it's really fun. I mean, there's like all kinds of like pocket smoke tests and all these things, and they're like different names for things you probably have heard because they're just like slight variations, but they can be really powerful, and it's definitely fun reading if you want to just expand your repertoire because you're in a rut around your testing.
Okay. And John had a question about Figma. Figma is a design and prototyping tool, similar to like InVision.
Mm-hmm. InVision's also a great tool.
And then Chris also followed up. He wanted Jonathan, you to repeat the title of that book you referenced.
Oh, it's called The Real Startup Book, and it's actually on GitBooks, I think. So you don't even have to buy this. It's out there, open source. So if you search that, Real Startup Book, you might have searched Tristan Kromer. You can also go in the GLIDR Help Center. It's an open source, so we worked with Tristan to bring it all into the GLIDR Help Center if you're a GLIDR user already. But otherwise, you can just look it up on GitBooks and find it there.
Okay. And I actually answered that on the chat. So excuse me if you heard the typing.
Oh, no.
But, hopefully I spelled it right. I figured Real Startup Book, how hard can it be, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we are in the loop here, in the figure eight infinite loop. We are at the stage of launching to building and then launching to test groups, I would imagine, Eric. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. We can talk about that. I mean, obviously we have limited time, so we want to jump into, there's lots of things we could talk about in the build process, but I think that's probably a little bit outside the scope for today. But the launch is kind of interesting because, this is almost like mini discovery in some ways, right? Because you're thinking about like, how do we roll something out? And maybe I'll step back a little bit, like think about how we do it at Pendo. If it's something really small, we might just push it out to everybody because it might just be a small change. Maybe it's a logo update. Maybe it's just some very simple changes we'd push out to everybody. And then as things get more and more complicated, the launch process gets more and more complicated. And I shouldn't even say complicated, more and more rigorous, right? So if it's a major launch or we're changing a new area or adding a new area of functionality, we'd have an iterative launch process. So we would start with rolling out, a new version to a subset of customers, usually in our beta customer group, and then we're getting feedback from them. Then we're making improvements to the product because most of the time we don't get 100% right? None of us do. So we make improvements and they roll it out to another subset of the beta group. And we do this until we get to a level of satisfaction that the outcomes our customers are getting from that area of functionality are as efficient as we're going to make them, or we're happy with where it is right now. And then we start thinking about then pushing that out to, a larger group. So there's this whole iteration process that's taking place during the launch process.
Yeah, and Eric, yesterday you talked about some of the challenges with continuous delivery. Can you say something about continuous delivery and UI changes and stuff like that? I think that was something.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring that up. I mean, and one of the things that maybe is a little contentious right now is like, you think about continuous delivery and you're like, do we release every single day, right? Which sounds great and it sounds like you're this great shop. But you also have this issue of how you do the change management there. So, salespeople need to know about all of these things that have changed. Marketing needs to make sure they have materials to support, either the new way of doing things or the new product functionality, whatever it happens to be. And then there's the customers that have to manage that too. So in particular, you mentioned UX. I mean, that can be just huge. Like customers are used to their workflow. They go like 1, 2, 3, and they're done, right? And now all of a sudden you make it A, B, C, and they're done. And it's completely different. So doing that a lot can just put a lot of strain on customers. So you have to be very cognizant of the changes you make and how you roll them out, both internally and externally. And we've actually taken the approach now, it's a little bit different, where we'll actually, we'll go through the testing process, we'll go through the iteration process I mentioned, but before the rollout to everyone, we'll actually package up a bunch of different features and functionalities into like what you might traditionally think of as a marketing or sales release and push it out all together, just trying to help our customers and our sales and internal teams, marketing teams, better be able to execute on the launch, right? And consume the changes. So in some ways, we're slowing down continuous delivery, which is both good and bad, but you have to make sure you're looking at things from your customer's eyes too. Like make sure that it's consumable, make sure it's helping them get their jobs done, and make sure it's aligned to outputs, and you're just not, pushing out features like a feature factory.
Yeah, because I think that the process of shipping software is really unique to the stage of the company, it's unique to the industry you're in and the type of software you're in. And, I think we found it, interesting and challenging because in the early days, I think some of the success we had was signing up some really big customers early on, who are early adopters of things. And yet, we were evolving functionality so fast and learning so fast that, we just kept making changes. And I remember having a conversation with a global financial institution. They said, how often are you guys pushing? And I was like, 5 times a week, like 5 every day. Thinking that was going to be awesome because we were so responsive to them and they were like a little bit terrified. We survived that and have matured over time. But I think it's really tempting to say like, we should just apply these like really quick changes, but really we need to consider who are our customers? What are they doing in our app? How critical is it to the systems and maybe even to safety in general, even physical safety, and all those things can impact the way that we ship software. And I think
when you're doing it, right? I mean, if you were making tax software, you're not pushing out on tax day, right? So you're locking that stuff down. If your software is, being consumed for, by e-commerce people, you're not pushing it down between, Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? When the big push is, unless it's something that's mission critical, something that's broken, something you really have to fix. And you're definitely not changing the user experience at that point, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ryan has a good question at this point. I can already guess what the answer might be given what you said earlier, Eric. But Ryan asks, do you feel this extreme continuous delivery, extreme in air quotes, can be derailed by the load placed on dev and IT?
I'm not sure what they mean by derailed there entirely, but I mean, I think what you really have to do is step back and think about what's best for your customers, right? And if you're really passionate about the problem you're solving and your customers and how it's helping them, make their lives better, and you use that as kind of your North Star, I think it guides how you do delivery. And so, it varies based upon what you're delivering, who your customers are, what market you're playing in. But I think you want to think about it, put your customer's shoes on, to take another like cliche, right? Walk a little bit in their shoes and think about how, your delivery schedule could impact them. And you want to make sure you're doing things so it impacts them positively, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, if it's a bug, if it's something's critical, if something's broken, you want to push those things out right away. If it's something that is, going back to that UX change, if it's something that's a UX change that has a minor benefit, you probably want to wait till you can package it up with other things that also have minor benefits to maybe make it a medium or major benefit. And you want to do that at a time that's good for them, because they're going to have to get used to, the new flow. So you really want to think about, what you're launching when, depending upon what's in the best interest of your customers. And I think if you do that, if you use that to guide yourself, then you're going to be going generally in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And there's and forgive me if I'm wrong, I once read, and this could be inaccurate, so those of you who are in the travel industry will have to tell me if this is true or not, but the travel, like flight searches, right? Like flight searches could be done a lot faster than they were done. Your app like Kayak feels like it's thinking a lot. The reality is the search results come back and they start displaying them a lot faster, but people felt uncomfortable that in the early days, that you weren't actually doing the thorough job of like looking through all the options. So they deliberately slowed it down. So sometimes you could move faster, but your customers aren't comfortable with you moving faster. So you deliberately introduce points of friction in the process to make that process ultimately deliver the value the customer needs. Because like your shipping is really about your customers, it's not about you.
Yeah, take another example of that. That's not even, it's product, but it's not even in the industry. Is like I ordered food the other night sitting at the bar and it came out way too fast. I'm thinking, what happened? Like, that now it could be, you could think of some really well automated, enterprise that knows how many orders of X they're going to get. So they have constantly things being fired, right? And your food could come out faster, I'm sure. But in this case, I'm looking at it and being like, why did my food get to me this fast? So that's another like just simple example of that perception. Like something's wrong here, because they delivered, even better than I expected.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a great example.
Yeah. Everybody I'm sure can relate to that one.
Yes, for sure. Okay. Well, so just to round out this illustration here. So we talked about launching the test groups. Eric, Eric and or Jonathan, can you guys just say a couple of brief sentences about how you would then take this full circle into expanding the audience and then broadening the release?
Yeah, I think I think I covered that. I might have jumped ahead a little bit when I was talking about test groups, but for us, it's an iterative process. You launch the test groups, you get to a level that you're happy with that area of functionality you want to push out, and then you expand to a greater audience. And for us, we release to everyone depending upon now the content. Like we've slowed down some of the delivery just to make things more consumable, both for internal and external people, and look at packaging up things that maybe aren't, mission critical into a group of things before we push it out to everyone, just to make it easier for consumption. Like I said, from a sales standpoint, making sure that they can address it, customer success and can support it, marketing can market to it, and customers can adapt and actually use it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And I think one thing that I just emphasize on the continuous discovery side of this is that, and Eric mentioned this in the early part, but like at each one of these phases, you're really doing whole loops through this process, right? So you're like, when you launch to a limited audience, you are then watching the feedback and the data and the usage, right? And then you're, potentially, if you have real deep questions, you might go through a whole other round of interviews and sort of thinking about how you can improve it and like running back. It's just that the loops may get a little tighter and faster in this process, but really you're still running loops at each phase, right? You're still evaluating the data. And that's the piece that I think is really critical, is that discovery doesn't stop just because you're building something. And
yeah, absolutely. And I know Patrick had a question here, which I thought was interesting. because it's another thing that I think is important for product orgs and how they're organized. And he was asking if you're envisioning devs and designers working together throughout this process. And I emphatically say yes. Like, I'm a big fan of devs and designers being on a team together. And, you know, it's not like design comes up with something and throws it over the wall to dev. No, it's an iterative. I think it works best. And I'm a strong proponent of them being on teams. It's an iterative process throughout the whole process. And that's really turning it, instead of one big handoff, we're having just little handoffs every day. And I think that is a much more efficient way, you know, to build product than having, you know, kind of what feels more waterfall-y in the other way. I mean, do you agree, Jonathan?
Oh, I think it's totally critical. I think having everybody, getting the whole team involved in the process, the whole team listening in at every phase is critical. I think there are a couple of nuances there. Patrick was also followed up with a question about, like, where does design happen? And, you know, you don't have to fit. So there's this like theory within Agile, right? That everything has to fit within the context of the sprint. The sprint's built around a developer building something, the Agile sprint, like the Scrum process. This process can run as a separate loop that has its own cadence. And design, what we do with design is that at each phase, we're designing, right? So first we're designing lots of potential solutions, and then we're starting to narrow that down. And as we test, we're actually doing design in the prototypes. It's not a full spec yet, but by the time we actually get to, and this doesn't have to take place in the context of a sprint, that we're actually building this functionality. That's the, I think, delusion sometimes. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, depending on the size of the challenge you're going down. But like, we're iterating that design. And so by the time we actually get to create a spec, it's not a real handoff type of spec. We just need to like take the various interaction patterns and like provide a little bit extra definition and then, you know, work on it. But most likely there's even been development started as we've gotten down to like, this is a solution. Now we're just tweaking, you know, flows and things like that. We know the data that's going to be there. And so things are starting to happen in sort of a stacked way as we're doing this. And discovery, by the way, also there was a thread on Twitter about like just putting your discovery into your sprint. Emphatically disagree with that process. Like, you don't need to try to cram everything into a development cycle, right? Like, these things can run as separate loops, and you can sort of start doing work along the way so that by the time you get to that place in your cycle, you have the design that you need, and you have and you're ready to go. And there haven't been a big waterfall-ish handoffs, just been little handoffs, as Eric said, every day.
Yeah, and that's why I actually like discovery versus this, you know, terminology, dual track agile. I think as you try to fit things into sprints, it feels like you're just jamming things together, where not every process needs to, you know, fit into a sprint or run concurrent with a sprint.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
He also asked, and I'm interested to know, Jonathan, when do you guys start doing high fidelity design?
It just really kind of depends. So if, you know, we try to build out the right design for the right learning. So if all I really want to know is sort of a basic flow, and I really don't want you to focus on visual, because I just need a quick idea of like, am I even on the right track in terms of the data I'm gathering or collecting or displaying? We'll build things that it's kind of easy for us to build a fairly high fidelity thing, but we'll build something sort of grayscale. But along the way, if I need you to actually understand the flow, we try to start to build high fidelity design because we feel like it's important for you to contextualize the flow within the experience you already know. And so that starts sometimes from day one.
Okay.
We just don't.
Yeah, and we're the same way too. So it's good to hear. And sometimes high fidelity can even be distracting, you know, early in a process. So I think it really depends upon what you're looking at getting feedback on, or what you're prototyping and testing. Obviously, when we're in the build and launch to test groups, we're with high fidelity design.
Yeah.
So with that, I would love to, before we get into our takeaways, I want to run a quick poll. This is just a very simple question of how you would categorize your role. I can probably guess as to the majority of answers, but I'm going to launch this poll right now. So for those of you on the webinar still, if you guys could just answer that would be great. And answers are coming in now. So sure enough, mostly product managers, but a good handful of designers, development, marketing, and other. All right, thanks. Well, I'll keep that poll open. And while I do, we will move on to takeaways. So Eric and Jonathan, in no particular order, can you guys just take us through what you think some of the primary takeaways are for the webinar?
Yeah, I'll start with that first one. We've talked about it a couple of times, but I like the way that's phrased in the sense that, like, look, continuous discovery is actually continuous. And I think that there's a tendency to want to be done. And that's natural. It's a very natural tendency. It's a tendency when you write code to want to be done with the software, not want to change it, not want to be wasteful. But, you know, there's a certain amount of that that's going to occur. And so you're going to change things in the process and you're going to keep learning. And so it is actually never done. It's just your job. But on any given feature or object, like sort of project you're working on, it continues until the objective is met on that particular project. And it's really hard. Like when it gets harder at each stage, right? Like as I launch and as things get out there, and then now it's actually off my like sort of Jira board and it's like shipped into the ether. And I don't, you know, that's the most important moment to measure and to make sure to tie it back. And I think that's where a lot of things get missed. Do you want to say anything else around that, Eric?
No, I was going to jump into the second one, which is just, you know, when's a good time to start? Today, right? Because in a lot of cases, people, especially if they have heavy research groups, they're trying to get everything perfect. And I think you just want to get started and you're going to improve the process as you get going. But I think you do need to just focus on getting started, focus on organizing that information, and you're going to make adjustments in your style, your particular, you know, process around discovery, you know, based upon your company, your market, and frankly, who you are. So just get started, you know, and tweak the process as you get going. There's lots of great resources out there, you know, to help you get it all kicked off. And then you find things that work for you and you adjust.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And this third one, conducting discovery as close to the product as possible. Say, Jonathan, perhaps you could say a little bit more about what is meant by that.
Yeah, so I think it's really, really critical that the people who are building the product actually are, to the degree possible, at the very minimum, on these calls and in like listening in, right? They're not even there. They should be active participants in the process of experimentation and learning, right? Because you need them to be able to pass that. So the context, the understanding of the why, the deep understanding of the customer, for this all to work, really, like your product, you know, product team for sure, designers for sure, engineering whenever they can. Some engineers really love being on these sorts of calls and some don't, but you got to have somebody on your team who is willing from the engineering side to jump onto these things as well for you to be really high functioning. So pushing it as close to the product, that's what I mean by that.
Okay. Well, we are very close to time here, so I will leave it open to any last questions. I did see some people raise their hands. If you could instead use the Q&A functionality, you've got another minute or two to get those in and we will get them answered.
Hey, John, so one thing I'll say just on top of the last thing is if there are user researchers in the group, in terms of getting it as close as possible, user researchers are such great resources, right? And I think the old way of sort of thinking about user research is like user research did their work and then pass it off to the product team. And I think that if this is going to get as fast as it needs to get and as continuous as it needs to get, user researchers need to start thinking about their role as empowering other people around them to become better researchers. You know, as a person with an anthropology background, that's always been my take on things. It's like everybody needs to know how to do this. I love it when other people are doing it, even if they're not perfect in doing it, right? And it's really, some researchers have a sense of like, oh, they're not going to get it exactly right. So there are certain things within, like, you know, clearly things that require data scientists and things. You got to get it right, or you're going to have really biased results. Other things, like, let's focus on like pushing out to the fringes the ability to do these things.
You stole my question. Now I can't ask you about how researchers and PMs should collaborate because you've already answered that. But I like it. I like that you're thinking like, it was like you're looking in my eyes and you knew what I was thinking.
All right. Well, I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who joined. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I also want to thank you, Eric and Jonathan, for being our guides through continuous discovery in product-led companies.
Thank you. This is great.
Yeah. Enjoyed it.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.